I'm delighted to be joined today by Sheena Frazer, a partner in Mayer Brown's Restructuring Group, where we're going to be talking about supply chain disruption. Sheena, over the past few months, we've seen widespread disruption to supply chains. Can you explain a little bit about why we've seen that?
Well, Amy, supply chain issues have been around for some time. Just as businesses were grappling with Brexit, COVID lockdowns came in and they were introduced at different times all across the globe. And then China's zero COVID policy has exacerbated these issues. More recently, I would say the Ukraine-Russia conflict has had some serious impact on some businesses, particularly those who rely on materials and components from those countries. Also, freight transportation has been an issue from Asia to Europe because the Russian airspace has been closed.
And are there particular industries that are worse affected than others?
Well, in an increasingly global market for supply chains, what happens is you have quite complex and multi-layered supply chain structures. That means that it's quite difficult to locate disruption in a particular industry. That said, there are certain industries that are suffering. So, for example, if we take the high energy users, so suppliers who are high energy users like paper factories, they're having to deal with not just with increased energy prices, but also potential shutdown of their supply. I think another example could be in companies within the global food supply chain. So those that are relying on agricultural output, there's been a shortage in fertilizer because a lot of fertilizer came from Russia and Ukraine, but also wheat is produced in big amounts in those countries.
So there's obviously those specific industries, but it's a general issue. And I suppose, what do companies then do to make sure they're regularly reviewing their supply chain if the majority of businesses are actually affected by this?
So I think at the procurement stage, a lot of businesses focus on their suppliers. They want to onboard a supplier who's financially stable, who can deliver their goods and services. Once that relationship is formed, I think the priority of monitoring those relationships is not as high. So if you don't monitor those relationships and don't continue to stress test them, you could be found with a supplier failing very quickly and you do not have an alternative supplier in place. That has a knock-on impact on your customer base and you may not be able to deliver your goods or services, and therefore the customer will potentially go to your competitors and it will have a real big and detrimental impact potentially on your brand. If you were monitoring your supply chain, so if you had an audit process in place, you could look for warning signs, you could put a contingency plan in place, so if there was going to be a supply failure, you can pivot to an alternative supplier or get one on board at the early stages.
You mentioned warning signs there. What sort of things should people be looking out for?
So I think there are a number of warning signs that you could readily reveal from a robust review process. So have there been any management changes or key employee changes in the supplier? Has there been a deterioration in their business? So are your deliveries coming late? Or have they asked for different payment terms? So for example, if they said, oh, I'd like an advance payment now. I think there's also a number of things that can be revealed from simple company's house searches. I mean, late filing of corporate accounts is a very classic warning sign. And then I should probably say this with caution, but market intel and gossip can also be a really kind of early trigger, and you can spot issues in suppliers just from what your competitors are saying on the market.
So what should people be thinking about from a legal perspective? What can they be doing to get themselves ready to protect against these sort of problems should they arise?
So I think the best time to consider the legal aspects is at the start of the relationship. That's when your negotiating position is the strongest. And what you can do is look to work in particular protections into your contractual arrangements. By that I mean, are there termination rights if the supplier goes into an insolvency process or if it's distressed? Or have you got payment terms which mean that payment is on delivery of goods rather than in advance of them? do you operate a business which has high value tools and machinery involved sometimes that you have to place with your supplier? If so, you want robust retention of title provisions so that you can recover those goods in the event of insolvency. And then as a part of your audit exercise, you should look at your existing arrangements and actually, do they have those protections? Do they need to be updated? Is there room to negotiate slightly more protective and stronger terms so you can put yourself in the best position?
And so that covers your legal protections. And practically, if something goes wrong, so you have a supplier maybe in financial difficulty or worse, goes into an insolvency process, what sort of practical things can clients be doing?
So if the supplier is in financial distress, not yet in a process, the first thing I would say to do is to call them and find out if they have a plan. Do they need more financial support? Have they spoken to their funders about support, or if they're in a broader group, their parent company? How likely is it that they'll get the financial support? What are the timescales? Is it realistic? I think those were the initial questions. You may be in a position, if it's a critical supplier, to offer funding to that supplier so you have some breathing space whilst you think about what you need to do to continue supplying your customers. I think if the company is in an insolvency process and that's the first time you found out about their financial position, what you would be doing is dealing with the insolvency office holder. Often that can be an administrator. And administrators are sometimes willing to continue to trade the business whilst it's in an insolvency process, provided that their fees are covered and also the overheads of the business are covered. Again, that could provide you with some breathing space while you contingency plan and line up an alternative supplier. I think the point to mention there is if it's, for example, a big supplier, they could be practical issues because it will be servicing a number of customers, and you would have to think about whether you can fund the overheads, or you could almost form a pact with the other customers to collectively prop up the supplier while you all consider what you're going to do next.
And is there actually an M&A opportunity here?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if the company is in financial distress and not in insolvency, you can have a pre-pack administration sale. So that's where you essentially agree the terms of a sale, and you implement that sale as soon as the administrators are appointed. There may be a competitor business who is buying the business of the supplier, and they may be willing to continue to supply you so you can have a seamless service. Equally, you may consider buying the business yourself, and if you have the infrastructure and the funds and it's a critical supplier. And then out of insolvency, when I talked about administrators continuing to trade a business, often they do that so they themselves can market the business and sell it to a purchaser. And again, that can mean the purchaser could onboard you as a customer, and you can continue supply there. So there are many ways that you can potentially have M&A opportunities.
And one of the expressions, or two of the expressions you hear quite a lot, are nearshoring and friendshoring, when you read about people trying to deal with problems and issues around their supply chain. So can you just talk through what those two expressions mean?
Essentially, that there are ways of deglobalizing your supply chain. So you are bringing your supply chain closer to your home nation, or to a network of allies and friendly countries. There's been a lot of debate around that during the pandemic, when there were lockdowns in different countries at different times, and it comes down to assessing the pros and cons of local supply versus a globalized and diverse supply chain. For example, if you bring your supply chain closer to home, that may mean that you have to charge higher prices for your goods because the manufacturing costs are higher, or the labour is more expensive. Equally, you may be narrowed down to a smaller pool of suppliers closer to home. So you really have to, for your business, think about what is the right balance of having a diverse portfolio of suppliers, but also trying to protect against some of the macro factors.
And ESG obviously is a hot topic in all sorts of areas. How much do you need to be thinking about ESG issues within your supply chain?
So I think it's become increasingly critical. lenders and investors and broader stakeholders are now demanding that businesses take responsibility for their ESG impact, that they have a robust and solid ESG agenda. Customers are also looking at who is producing their products. I think until recent times that's been quite voluntary in terms of what you do on the ESG front, but there's been rapid and evolving legislative reform across the EU, which is now looking to bring in mandatory aspects and compliance with ESG goals, and particularly around maybe modern slavery and the environment. And therefore, I think businesses now really need to make sure that ESG is embedded within their businesses, but also looking at their counterparties and making sure their supply chain is aligned with their own ESG goals.
Thank you, Sheena. That was incredibly interesting. Just for the final question, can you tell me what your key takeaways would be for any clients watching today?
So I think my top tip would be to plan. Have a look at your legal protections in your contracts at origination, but also as a part of your audit exercise. Look at a contingency plan. Are there alternative suppliers, whether they're within your existing pool of suppliers or on the market? How could you feed them in if there was financial distress with one of your suppliers? I would put in a audit process so that you can continually monitor your suppliers and look for those warning signs that I mentioned. And finally, do take ESG seriously and look at your own agenda and also your supply chain and whether your suppliers are aligned with that.